All right, we are now starting Unit 4. Unit 4 is all about land use. All right, we've already talked about what makes up land. We've talked about how the land on Earth is moving through plate tectonics. We talked about the crust of that land being shaped by tectonic forces and folds and faults and moving all over the place and being pushed and pulled apart, depending on the type of plate boundaries and the plate movements. We've also talked about what that land is made up of, what the rocks are made up of, and how those rocks are formed, and how those rocks are destroyed and moved around, weathered and eroded. So in this unit, we're going to jump away from the more earth sciencey stuff that we've been talking about so far and jump more into that environmental part of environmental earth science. And we're going to start out by looking at how we use land. This is also the first unit where we're going to rely, or where the material relies heavily on that new digital textbook that you guys hopefully have already downloaded. This is chapter 14. We're going to run right with it. Now, we're not going to assign you anything at home out of chapter 14. Your homework, as it has been, is going to be to, finish up a little bit of classwork here and there, but mostly watch these videos, take these notes. But if you have downloaded the textbook or the textbook app, and you have downloaded or are in the process of downloading different units, try to get the unit that deals with chapter 14. You can read it on your own if you wish. You don't have to, but it's another tool to study from in this upcoming unit, and it's all about land use. So we're going to start off by talking about how we humans use land. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at land, and we're going to separate it into its two main categories. There is urban land, which is what most of us live in. Suburban land also ends up being classified as urban. And this is land covered with buildings and roads and houses and stores and malls and that kind of stuff. And then there is rural land, which are generally open areas of space, contains relatively few people compared to the urban land. Some of you, if you live out in Hopewell or even myself out in Farmington, even though I'm in more of a suburban-like community, if you look at an aerial map of Farmington, there's a lot of wide open farmland and rangeland. So I'm kind of in more of a rural area than somebody who lives in Fairport or Pittsford or Brighton or the city of Rochester, which is definitely urban. And while we can separate it into the two broad categories of urban and rural, the U.S. itself, we splits up land use into 6 categories. There's rangelands and pastures, places where we graze livestock. Forest land, which is made up of forests, and it's where we get a lot of wood and wildlife and hunting areas would be considered forest land. Farmland or cropland, that's pretty easy enough to figure out. It's where we're planting food and crops. Parks and preserves are lands used for recreation, camping, scenic enjoyment, trying to preserve natural areas. Urban land is land used for houses, businesses, and industry. And then there's other, and this kind of got cut off here. So the other land is land that is difficult to adapt to human use. Alright, and then there were some examples like wetlands, deserts, mountains. All right, those are tough areas, especially peaks of mountains and everything, that are harder for us to use. And that is under other. If we look at this map here, or this, no, it's not really a map, this pie chart, you can see over the U.S., most of our land, believe it or not, in the U.S. is still forest land. And then we have a lot of rangeland and pastures. And living where we do, we might not think about this. But if you ever fly across the middle of the country, a lot of wide open rolling plains, which is a lot of rangeland in that breadbasket. And then there's also cropland mixed in there as well. Only 3% of our land is classified as urban, but that's where most of the people live. And in the U.S., according to the laws, for urban land, you need 2,500 or more people, and usually has a governing body, such as a city council or even a mayor, something like that. Rural is described as open land, and most land gives us resources we need. All right, and we need wood from forests, we need crops from farming, we need mineral resources, which could come from several of the different types of land. And land is very important to us. All right, before 1850, many people lived in rural areas, wide open areas. People used to grow stuff, farmers, they'd raise livestock. All right, and they made what they needed where they lived. After the 1850s, though, we started to see a big change. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. We made new machinery. Less people needed to work on the farms. And this reduced the number of jobs available in rural areas by thousands. Businesses no longer had to make their stuff right where they sold it. There were now ways to ship it. All right? And so we had a big shift to urban. Within the 20th century and today, especially in developing countries, we had this huge shift of people to cities and urban areas. We got here, this is showing the percentage of the population living in rural and urban land. Here we are in North America, well-developed countries. Most of our people, almost 80%, are living in urban areas. All right, same with Europe. If we look at Africa and Asia, where most of the third world countries are the developing world, most people are still living in rural areas, but that is changing quickly. Now, whether we live in a city or whether we live out in farm country, we need stuff produced in rural areas. All right? That's where our clean drinking water comes from. The water for the city of Rochester comes from Hemlock Lake. One of the Finger Lakes is a very rural area. There is not a whole lot of housing and industry there. It gets pumped in. Soil and cropland. All right, crops. Crops equals food. All right, this comes from the rural areas. Trees come from rural areas, and then oxygen, which we don't always think of, is produced by plants. Well, there's not a lot of plants in the so-called concrete jungle of a downtown metropolitan area. All right, so all this stuff comes from rural areas. We are still dependent on them, but rural areas are disappearing as we build bigger and bigger cities. One of the big things that we need from these rural areas are the most important stuff. We name them ecosystem services. These are the roles that the other organisms play in our lives. All right, we want a healthy environment for ourselves. We depend on other organisms. All right, other organisms do all these different things. All right, and we're going to hit on a lot of these as we go through this unit and future units. All right. Aesthetic beauty, just to kind of hit on this last one here, that means that it looks nice. It's pretty. All right, we like to go look at scenic scenery. All right, that's why people own cottages in the Adirondacks and around the Finger Lakes, because it is beautiful looking there. People like to go hiking because they like to be in nature, because they like how it looks and how it feels. Those are part of the healthy environments, and we get those from the rural land. Now, rural land supports many different people, and how much rural land we need to support one person depends on the area that rural land is in. It depends on the climate. All right, climate can play a big role in an area like ours where we have nights and days below freezing. We need more rural land to produce textiles to make our clothing and keep us warm during the winter years, or wood for our fires, or certain other natural resources that we get from these rural areas. The standard of living plays a big role, all right? We have a pretty decent standard of living here in the United States compared to a lot of the rest of the world. So we use more resources to keep our standard of living where it is. In developed countries like ours, we need about 8 acres of land for keeping our ecosystem services happy, on keeping ourselves in healthy environments. Each person, 8 hectares. All right, don't worry too much about what a hectare is. It's just, we need 8 of them. All right, that's just giving us a unit of land. In developing countries, they don't necessarily have access to all the resources. They might not have enough land for food, or enough land for clothes, or enough land that provides clean water or energy, or a bunch of different things. And a lot of times people are forced to live off of less than 1 hectare, 1/8 as much as we get here in the U.S. So we really need to efficiently or effectively use our resources here. It's why we're doing the environmental stuff here, to just get a little taste of how important using our resources wisely can be. As we go on in this unit, we will talk more about the movement from rural to urban areas, and the problems that have arisen with those areas, and then what we can do to conserve and make better use of our rural areas. This is just the introduction of this unit. We will have a couple more lectures in here, and you'll get to see things and do things about how to use land wisely, and maybe even how we are using land wisely. So if you have any questions on this, let us know. We'll answer them in class, and you have a good night.